once again, everybody, and welcome to part 3 of our Chapter 2 lecture series, where we'll be discussing the English settlements in New England. The focus question for this section is, what made the English settlement of New England distinctive? The first settlers of what would become the New England region were known as the Pilgrims. Now, these were Puritan religious dissidents from England. The Puritans were a faction within England who desired to purify the Anglican Church. They traveled to the Americas in 1620 to establish a religious community free from what they viewed as Anglican corruption of religious morals and values. Now, they were supposed to land in Virginia. However, a storm blew them off course and ended up landing in what would become Massachusetts and established the Plymouth colony there. Now, their original charter for the land in Virginia was no good anymore. They did not land in Virginia. So they had to establish a new charter, which they dubbed the Mayflower Compact, named after one of the vessels that they traveled to the region in, the Mayflower. It stands as the first written frame of government in English America. However, initially it was actually illegal. They did not really have the authority to establish such an agreement or compact on their own accord. However, the agreement was later recognized by England, which gave it then some legal authority. Now, similar to the experience of the colonists in Roanoke, particularly that third expedition led by John White, the Pilgrims arrived after the planting season. So they struggled initially for their very survival and only survived through the help of local Indians. Now, it's important to understand that the Indian communities in the region had already been decimated by European diseases. Those diseases brought to the New World initially by the Spanish, and also there were already by this time some fishing grounds established, particularly off the coast of Newfoundland in what is now Canada, by the English and the French. So they already had some limited contact with the Native Americans of the region, and that contact brought in those diseases with them. And many of the Indian communities in the region that would later become Massachusetts and New England had already been decimated by these diseases. And this led many of the Pilgrims and subsequent English settlers to believe that much of the land was empty and ripe for English settlement, despite the fact that there were obviously still some Indian communities who lived in the region. Now, a particular Native American who was especially helpful to the Pilgrims of Plymouth Colony was a gentleman by the name of Tisquantum, otherwise known as Squanto. Now, he had a very interesting backstory. He already knew English, so he was a perfect liaison between the Pilgrims and the Native American communities. He had previously been captured by the Spanish and enslaved in Spain, managed to escape his enslavement in Spain, and managed to make his way to England, where he spent a few years and thus learned English there. And then after a few years in English, he managed to make his way back to the New World, where he discovered that the village that he was from, that he grew up in, no longer existed. It was one of the first victims of these European diseases that had come prior to the Pilgrims actually landing in the region. He helped to teach the Pilgrims to hunt, to farm, to fish in a Native American fashion, which greatly enhanced the ability of the Pilgrims to establish a permanent colony in the area. And around this time, shortly after this experience between Squanto and the Pilgrims, they celebrated what has come down in legend as the first Thanksgiving, where the Pilgrims and the Native Americans got together to celebrate their mutual understanding of the settlement in the region and their mutual assistance to each other. Now, the Pilgrims themselves and the patterns of settlement that they established in New England were quite different from the experience of the Jamestown colonists down in Virginia. Whereas the Jamestown colonists were primarily young single men seeking their fame and fortune in the New World, the Puritans were of a very different lot. Between initial landing in 1620 and 1642, it was a period known as the Great Migration. About 21,000 Puritans came over to the New England region, particularly the Plymouth colony at the beginning. Most settlers arrived in full family units, husband, wives, children. The settlers were mostly from the middle to upper class of English society, not unlanded poor, as was the primary feature of settlement in the Chesapeake region, particularly those indentured servants that we have talked about. And because of these family units, the population grew very rapidly in the New England region. The Puritan family was very much patterned along patriarchal family patterns, where male authority was the foundation of social stability according to the mindset of these people. Women were considered as spiritual equals, but not social equals. And women's lives were shaped by their role as wives and mothers, a pattern that would repeat itself over and over again in the social structure of American society in general, and particularly New England society specifically. Now, the structure of government and society in Puritan New England was also quite different from that in the Chesapeake region of the Americas. The Puritans organized themselves into self-governing townships, each with its own church and school, and all male head of households who owned property, and more specifically were members of the church, could vote and hold office. And the principle of consent was really very central to the ideas of Puritan religion and government, and really helped to establish a sort of democratic social order very early on in New England society. Now, the Puritan social structure was very hierarchical. Every person had their place and their role in society. The Puritans feared excessive individualism and social disorder. Religious uniformity was vital to that social order in their worldview. There is a lot of myth around the idea that the Puritans came to the New World seeking religious freedom, which is true in a sense. But this was not universal religious freedom. They sought religious freedom to practice their own brand of religion, but they were very fearful and obstinate towards any other religious beliefs or practices, and really did their best to discourage any sort of break with the dominant religious and social order. They believed that everyone should serve the good of the community. This was that fear of excessive individualism coming out in their society. And their concept of liberties were based on privileges derived from one's place in the social order. The extent of one's liberty or freedom was very much determined by where in that social hierarchy one found oneself in. They believed that inequality was actually God's will, that God mandated that certain people should be held above others, and certain people were designated and more fit to rule or govern than others. And of course, the higher in this social order one was, the more liberties or freedoms that were obtained through that place in the social order. Now, a gentleman by the name of John Winthrop was one of the early leaders of Puritan New England, and he had this idea of New England as what he called a city upon a hill, which was supposed to be a perfect religious and social society that should stand above all others as an example for others to follow. They believed that they held a covenant with God that demanded the translation of faith into direct social and political action. There was no separation of church and state. They were really one and the same in this Puritan worldview. They also believed in education and the importance of education for both men and women, actually. And they believed in this individual interpretation of the Bible, which would come to contradict this idea that they held at the same time of religious uniformity. A gentleman by the name of Roger Williams was one of the first dissenters against this dominant Puritan ideology, and he was the first to really argue for a separation of church and state, that the two should not work in tandem with each other, but should have separate spheres of influence. He also challenged the view that Native Americans held no claim to the land that they resided on because they had not improved it. And what is meant by improvement is actually putting it into productive farming practice according to an English or European way. Now, of course, Native Americans did not view land or farming in the same fashion that the Puritans or other Europeans did, so this led to some great confusion, particularly among Native Americans, as to exactly what the Puritans meant by improving the land, which of course would lead to additional conflicts and tensions between the two societies. Roger Williams' dissent against the Puritan ideology led him to be banished from Massachusetts, and he went on to found the colony of Rhode Island, which really became the first place where this practice of the separation of church and state was put into place. Rhode Island became a haven for other Puritan dissenters. Now, another important dissenter against the dominant Puritan ideology of the time was a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Now, particularly because she was a woman, she greatly upset that social order of Puritan New England at the time, and she actually was put on trial for preaching herself, which was a no-no according to Puritan social hierarchical structures, and for holding religious meetings in her own home away from the established church. She disagreed with the popular Puritan theology, which was particularly alarming to Puritans, again, because she was a woman. She was tried as a heretic, and like Roger Williams, she was exiled or banished from the Massachusetts or Plymouth colony. Other exiled dissenters went on to found the colonies of New Haven and Hartford in the 1630s, which later combined into the larger colony of Connecticut. Similar to the situation in the Chesapeake region and the tensions between the Jamestown colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy, the tensions between the Puritan colonists in New England and the Native Americans pretty quickly erupted into outright warfare. The Pequots were one of the more powerful Indian tribes of the New England region at the time, and the Pequot War erupted in 1637 after the Pequots killed a local Puritan fur trader. The Pequots were, again, one of the more powerful tribes in the region, and they controlled the lucrative wampum and the fur trade between the Native Americans and the colonists at the time. Now, wampum was actually used as currency among Indians, and it was made from European manufactured glass beads. So even the wampum trade was very distinctly tied in with the larger Atlantic and European American trade. Other Indian tribes in the region were particularly jealous of the Pequots and their control over this lucrative wampum and fur trade. Particularly a tribe known as the Mohegans sided with the English against the Pequots in the Pequot War. They saw it as an opportunity to snatch control of that lucrative trade away from the Pequots and enhance their own wealth and status in the region. And this is an example of just how fractured Indian society was at the time. There was no concept of a universal Indian ethnicity or race. Each tribe identified first and foremost with their individual tribe rather than this larger concept of an Indian ethnicity or race. And that was true for not just Native Americans, but Europeans, Africans, and really all other cultures at the time. A race, as we understand it, just didn't exist in the concept and the worldviews of peoples of this era. Now, the retaliation against the Pequots led to an almost total extermination of the tribe. Many were sold off into slavery into the Caribbean, and the war led many New Englanders to demonize the natives as savages, even amongst the allied tribes that helped them out. Now, this drawing you see right here is a contemporary drawing of what was known as the Battle of the Mystic River, which was one of the primary battles in the Pequot War that saw the English and their native allies completely surround a native village and put it to the torch and literally slaughter anybody who tried to run away from the flames. This was a particularly violent episode in the war, and it was an episode that would be remembered for a very long time, especially among the Allied Native American groups whose concept of war and warfare was quite different from the English. And they saw what the English did with putting this village to the torch and literally assassinated anybody who tried to escape as a sort of a bridge too far, as a little bit too violent for their own particular taste. The New England economy was directly tied to a sense of economic independence that was related directly to land ownership or status as a craftsman, someone who made goods with their hands, like carpenters, millers, shoemakers, etc. Fishing and timber were the primary exports of New England at this time, and the economy was really focused primarily on family farms that produced only a small marketable surplus. Most of it was reserved for the family's individual use. They had few slaves or indentured servants, especially because Puritan families were so large. They had all of the necessary labor they needed within that family unit to produce what they needed on these farms. Now, concurrent with all of that, and because of the lucrative trade going on in the region, particularly among the Native Americans and the colonists, there arose a new merchant elite who really controlled not only that Indian trade, but also the export trade of fish and timber. And they really began to challenge the Puritan ideas of subordinating economic activity to the common good. This idea of excessive individualism that the Puritans really pushed back against really began to come to the fore as the merchant elite began to rise in power and influence. And eventually these merchants came to dominate public affairs and the local governments of Puritan New England, which drastically altered the social structure and created all sorts of new tensions between this initial Puritan religious, social, political ideology and this new kind of more secular economic ideology that was emerging because of the success of this merchant elite. The rise of this merchant class and the continued descent going on in Puritan New England greatly weakened the strength of the Puritan church in New England. Fewer and fewer people could pass the conversion tests that were required for full church membership. Basically, these conversion tests were something where people had to stand in front of the church and explain in a very passionate way their own conversion episode that would prove to the church their full faith in the Puritan ideology. Membership in the church was still legally required for full participation in civil affairs, but many were straying from these Puritan values and norms. So fewer and fewer people were actually full members of the church, which pretty much relegated them to a sense of second-class citizens, if you will. Now, Puritan ministers excoriated colonists for straying from the path, and with fire and brimstone condemned this abandonment of Puritan ideology. However, due to the continued rise in more secular ways of life and modes of thought, and the weakening of the church, in 1662, the governments of the region decided upon a policy known as the Halfway Covenant, which allowed for a halfway membership in the church. One no longer had to pass these conversion tests in order to be considered a member of the church. And church membership came to be more and more tied with one's ancestry, not religious conversion. But this halfway covenant did allow access to full civil and political participation for those not considered full church members, those that had passed this conversion test. That concludes part 3 of our Chapter 2 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.